Here we see the endoscopic view at 30 degrees, directed anteriorly to the right lateral ventricle. The foramen of Monro is easily identifiable, bounded medially by the anterior septal vein, posteriorly by the terminus of the choroid plexus, and laterally by the thalamostriate vein. Slightly turning the endoscope about its axis, the orientation of the endoscope at 30 degrees makes a panoramic view of the lateral ventricle possible. On the midline, the septum, which at this point is fenestrated, is easily identifiable. The fornix runs under the bottom part of the septum. Continuing with the rotation, the posterior part of the lateral ventricle, in particular the occipital horn, comes into view. The rotation continues laterally, offering a view of the superior part of the thalamus at the junction of the thalamus and the body of the caudate nucleus. This is traversed by caudate veins, which drain into the main vein. Next, passing through the interventricular foramen of Monro, the endoscope is carefully inserted into the cavity of the third ventricle. The anterior pillars of the fornix constitute the anterior boundary of the foramen of Monro. Directly underneath, the anterior white commissure is visible. In the deepest part of the ventricle, the optic chiasm is already visible. Above the optic chiasm, the supraoptic recess is observed, and on passing it, the anterior communicating artery complex can be seen pulsating. Posteriorly to the chiasm, the infundibular recess is easily identified. Posteriorly to the infundibular recess, the dorsum celli is visible. Next, the anterior part of the third ventricle, with the optic chiasm at its anterior boundary, is clearly identified, followed by the infundibular recess, which is always easy to identify as a landmark. Posteriorly to it, the dorsum celli can be seen through the structures. Posteriorly are the left and right mammillary bodies, and anteriorly to these two structures, the premammillary recess. It's in the mammillary recess that the endoscopic third ventriculostomy is performed using forceps. Note that the edges of the opening and the recess are pulsating immediately, which constitutes evidence of good flow of the cerebrospinal fluid between the cistern and the third ventricle. Advancing through the opening created while maintaining constant contact, the peduncular cistern is gradually revealed in front of the clivus. The basilar artery runs along the anterior part of the brain stem with multiple perforating branches. The dura mater of the clivus is easily identified in the forefront. At this stage, endoscopic third ventriculostomy is considered to be fully successful. The endoscope is carefully withdrawn from the cistern to the lumen of the third ventricle. Note the movements at the edges of the endoscopic third ventriculostomy associated with the restored pulsation of the cerebrospinal fluid. To visualize the posterior part of the third ventricle, it's preferable to re-enter the lumen of the lateral ventricle and to rotate the optics by 30 degrees. This permits perfect control of the posterior portion of the foramen of Monro before re-entering the cavity of the third ventricle. In this region, the 30-degree field of view offers a panoramic view. The first visible structure is the interthalamic adhesion. Passing under this structure, the opening of the dilated aqueduct of Sylvius becomes visible, bordered on top by the posterior commissure. Passing over to the other side of the commissure, one has a perfect view of this posterior commissure, and above it, below in this picture, the tela choroida of the third ventricle.